The next day, Saturday, I knew it would be awesome. When the gang got together at the twins' house after lunch, I revealed the sets, and they were excited about the whole idea of having our own laser guns. The foreign sets, of course, took the spotlight over the regular American ones. Brian suggested that we do some rock, paper, scissors to see who would get to use them. But after a debate in the end, I claimed one of them, having been the one to find them. We had to compensate a bit since the foreigns didn't have backpack units, making sneak attacks from the rear impossible on its wearers. This would be a huge disadvantage to the others, so we simply kept the American set's rear hit backpacks inside. It was sort of lame only being able to land a hit officially on someone's front side, which meant waiting for them to simply turn around to actually kill them if you were stalking behind them. But we would deal with it. Nick was a little offended at first after I explained the reason he should get the other. He usually died first, the most often, and was a lousy shot. Quite an accomplishment, considering the accuracy of imagined slugs. But his brother Peter agreed with the handicap, and with that, we were off for a day of team death matches around the neighborhood. Gil and Brian were on my team the first time, and we kicked some serious butt, with a solid score of 3-0. After that, I took Nick and Devin, so both of the old sets were on a single team. Devin got taken down, but Nick and I were untouched by a long-ranged ambush that took place in one of our block's curves. That was the first indication that these old sets really were higher quality, or at least more powerful than the others. While Devin shot 3 or 4 times before he was hit, none of them made an impact on Brian, Peter, or Gil. But the guns that Nick and I had took out the entire enemy team. One right after the other, after we took a second to steady our aim. After a third game, we realized that having 2 boys with the old sets on one team gave them an unfair advantage. Having skimmed the manual for the American toys, I remembered reading how sunlight could interfere with the laser. That made sense, but it seemed like the advertised 200 feet range was also a lie in the first place, as Gil reported that he had to get within about 50 feet to land a hit with his plastic gray gun. The black ones, however, we took a break to figure out their range by doing a few tests. Having Brian back up about 10 feet until Peter's hits with my black gun no longer registered. He had to be clear across the block, some 500 feet away. Even then in direct sunlight, his vest stopped buzzing. We all thought once again about just how cool these things were, but I was a bit unsettled. They felt too powerful, as if they were industrial lasers embedded in the black guns that kids should have no business playing with. What if they hit someone in the eye? But to the others, the pistols had basically turned into sniper rifles. Sure, we still had to be accurate at long range, but we could land a hit from much farther away than seemed normal. The discovery of the foreign set's abilities changed the game dynamic. Suddenly, Nick and I deemed permanent squad leaders. We were the specialists, meant to be feared. That was when Peter started asking me to switch up gear with him. I told him he could have my set tomorrow, but after a few more games, he started whining and moaning about it. At 3 o'clock, we broke for snacks and soda and water to replenish ourselves. We had played long and hard so far, and the other people in the neighborhood had taken notice of our antics, but we were having way too much fun to notice or care what they thought of us. Being a nice guy, I relented and told Peter he could have my set for the next round of games that would last until we called it an evening. He had the best aim, and a maniacal little grin spread over his face as he, no doubt, wondered what it would be like pulling off miracle shots as a professional sniper could. The thing was, though, Nick and I couldn't get the vests off. We tried everything, but the buckles were oddly configured. We couldn't even tell if we weren't pressing the right thing down on them, or if we had to wiggle them a certain way, or if it was the friction caused by the rust that locked them in place. We eventually gave up and had our indoor snack break with them still on, looking like dorks, somewhat to the amusement of the others. Even though I couldn't get my vest off, I still traded guns with Peter. It seemed to be good enough for him. Holding the cheap gray plastic in my hand, I knew it was going to take a little while to get used to its limitations. As the day wore on and cooled a bit with the setting sun, I started taking my first hits without the advantage of longer range, and I really began to take notice of the strange quirks of the vest. For one, it was uncomfortable. The leather straps that went over my shoulders and around my stomach would have been more comfortable if they weren't so tight. On top of this, the metal plate on the backside of the hit detection unit, pressed tightly against the skin, was cold, never warming to body temperature. Also, once I took a hit for the first time, I could feel a small tingle of electricity come from the back plate. It was really small. However, less than that of a static shock. I didn't even notice it most of the time, but it was there. I couldn't tell if it was deliberate, like some sort of failing impact feedback, or more like something bigger, being contained but leaking out ever so slightly each time the laser strand was close enough to be detected by the circle in the front. But the oddest thing of all were the power lines nearby. They were old and buzzed often in cycles, but whenever I drew near them, they seemed to either buzz louder or started buzzing if they were quiet at that time. I had learned about electrical fields in science class that last year of middle school, thought that something in the hitbox might have been causing some sort of interference. But I didn't really think about how powerful the battery would have had to be to do such a thing. I did, however, begin to feel unsafe hauling it around. And thinking back, I suddenly remembered the moment my dad had turned it on for the first time in the store. I thought nothing of it then, but when he did that, the fluorescent light above us flickered, just briefly. I had grown up with a fear of electricity. Outlets had always scared the crap out of me as a kid, as if simply touching any part of it would electrocute me. A gut feeling told me something was wrong with this toy, and I wish I had said something or called off the game completely. After the first game following snacks, when I let the other team use both of the black guns and we got creamed, Peter gave us his brother Nick to even the score. He joined Devin and I after the 60-second countdown that was used to get the teams separated from one another. We headed out, deciding to go on patrol instead of making a base this time, as Devin never liked to sit around and wait for the opposition to find us. Peter's team must have been doing a good job at hiding, because we couldn't find them after 2 sweeps of the block. It was a good idea to separate the team for a bit. We looked behind every one of our houses, covered the adjacent block, and still found no sign of them. It was a good idea to separate the team a bit, so it wasn't taken down in a single ambush, but I always hated breaking up completely and going on patrol alone. But Peter and his sneaky gang wanted to play things this way, so we had little choice but to separate and cover more ground. I checked to make sure Devin and Nick had their walkie-talkies set to the proper channels, and we headed our separate ways. Now, alone, my senses heightened. I could feel the beads of sweat on my forehead and hear the faint buzzing of the drooping power lines. It was quiet. The air was still. Everyone else in the neighborhood had gone inside. Getting tired of the round, I started walking down the middle of the streets, putting myself in the open. If someone moved to take a shot at me, I might react in time, maybe not. It was, after all, just a game. And I was growing impatient and wanted them to come out. I got my wish. As I walked down the empty street just in front of my house, Brian leapt out of some bushes, took aim at me, and fired. I heard the buzz, felt the tingle, and looked down to see the red lights disappear. Proud of his kill, Brian smiled and walked over to me. Despite being a little annoyed that his team decided to hide like pansies this round, I still thought of a little compliment to give him, but it never left my mouth. Just as he stepped in front of me, I heard a loud pop in the distance. It sounded electrical, like a transformer had just blown. At the same time, our 2 walkie-talkies let out a loud, brief burst of static. Brian and I looked around, maybe expecting to see sparks raining down from the power pole or something. We waited for a few minutes, still out in the open. Brian staying with me despite being on the opposite team. The pop had taken us out of the game. Startled us. We eventually settled down again and got ready to part ways. Brian back to his hiding spot, and myself to the dead zone. But then, God, that horrible smell. I knew what it was. I think everybody does. That stinging stench of an electrical burn. It's similar to dust burning off in a heater. But whereas that aroma is almost pleasant in a way, an electrical burn is a threatening smell you never want to experience. The last time I had was when our microwave practically exploded last year, which was unpleasant. With the possibility of a fire being nearby, we dropped the game and, using Brian's walkie-talkie, tried to get in touch with Peter and Gil. We got no response the first few times we tried to contact them, but on the 5th try, some feedback suggested that someone on the other end was holding down on the transponder button. But no one on the other end spoke. But we heard something. Brian had to turn up the volume all the way to hear it. Faint sobbing. Worried for our friends, we ran off together, scouring the neighborhood. It took us 10 minutes to see Devin, who had spotted us first and was waving us down from the edge of the borderline of the playing field, the farthest possible sidewalk on the last block of the neighborhood. Stepping out onto the road from it made you dead, at least if anyone else were to see you do it. We rushed over to him and saw Gil examining the sharp incline by the side of the road, where the storm drain feeds runoff water down into a ditch-like area that was often muddy. It was also overgrown with weeds and vines that climbed up the nearby cedar trees, which condensed into an ugly little forest, typically occupied by drunks and garbage. For reasons we never really understood, this area on the edge of our battlefield was Nick's favorite hiding spot. He would sometimes still be in the ditch, eyes peeking out at the street level, after the entire opposing team was already dead. Next to Gil was Peter, in a way I'd never seen him before. He was in a state of shock, rocking back and forth very gently in a fetal position. I asked everyone what happened, but Gil wasn't around at the time and knew nothing about it. Peter had yet to say a word, and Nick was nowhere in sight. I tried to coax an answer from Peter, but he just looked back at me with saucer eyes. When I started shaking him and demanded to know what had happened, and he muttered something. But it was so quiet, he may as well have just mouthed it silently. To this day, however, the closest thing I can think of as to what he said would be, "I saw him. I shot him." My stomach dropped. Peter didn't give me a straight answer, but I still had a deep and increasing worry that something terrible had happened to Nick. That maybe the hitbox had electrocuted him. It was morbid, but that's the conclusion my mind had instantly leapt to. Gil, Brian, Devin, and I searched the area, sinking into the mud on occasion. I sniffed the air, smelling the electrical burn again. Every second that passed by, that we didn't find Nick in pain or worse, was a small relief. But we didn't find a trace of him at all, until we started heading back to Peter. Hidden in some overgrowth on the incline, their red color now distinguishable in the grass, were Nick's shoes. Gil looked at them closer, but when he tried to pick them up, Peter suddenly shouted, "Don't touch them!" Gil abided by the request. Panic overtook the four of us, that we were still in reality, and we quickly ran to Devin's house, the closest to our current position, and told his parents. They finally called the police when we managed to convince them that we weren't pulling a prank, and we really couldn't find Nick. The rest of the day was hell, but at least it went by quickly. The police arrived as everyone's parents did. Peter's father took him home, as he was too traumatized to help the officers in any way. As more cop cars arrived, we explained everything about what we were doing. One of the cops even mentioned how he had noticed us earlier, that day while on patrol. A search party started around sunset, and all the while we were stuck outside in the heat, sweating like crazy on the side of the road as our hearts raced. The police had little to go on and no witnesses other than Peter, who they knew they would need to talk to right away. I was the first to suggest to them to find the hit sensor box and gun from the laser set. That made them a little curious. I explained the devices as much as I could, even the tingling I felt. They may have concluded the toy sounded dangerous, but still, it was just a toy. Nevertheless, they decided to take the foreign set in for further investigation. I had no arguments. After what might have just happened to Nick, I wanted nothing to do with the set anymore. Or for that matter, laser guns or guns. I knew the game, in whatever form it could have taken after this day, was tainted now. They quickly found Peter's gun, dropped in the tall grass right by where he had been sitting. Nick's was discovered soon after, not far from his shoes. But even with their help, I couldn't get my vest off. The thing felt like it was permanently strapped to my body. It finally took Devin's father bringing a pair of metal shears from his garage to get the hitbox off me, and he had to work to cut through the thick leather straps. But at least I was free. Safe. The police took the device and began to search for the other. Only, like Nick, they never found it. Over the following weeks, they combed the entire area for both the hitbox and its wearer, even dredging up the mud to see if it had sunken into it. I began to have visions of it exploding in a bright nuclear fireball, vaporizing Nick. But I kept the nightmares to myself. The twins' parents must have suffered more than I did, and I knew it was my fault. Despite all the assurances that day, and the ones that followed from the police, Nick was never found. His disappearance made the local news, and then the state news. No suspects were ever named. Every time I walked by the missing children board in Walmart, I saw his face haunting me, staring at me above the description and the number to call. I saw that poster hanging for years, until I went off to college and left my old town and friends behind, all of which were irrevocably shattered by the incident. In my senior year, I came out for winter break. By now, I had invented that reality I mentioned earlier. I shoved the idea of a laser tag killing toy out of my mind, coming to believe, like the town did, that Nick had just ended up as just another vanished or abducted child that would never return. Coming home, I had a flashback of his funeral, 2 years after he disappeared, where I was unable to look at his parents or Peter in the eye from across Nick's empty casket. The past didn't stay dead. When I came home, my mother told me in a shallow voice that Peter had been calling recently, asking for me every other day. She told me I should go see him. I didn't want to, but of course I had to. I walked over to his house, where he still lived with his parents. The place had gone to hell. The paint was peeling off. The grass was so tall that trees could have began sprouting. And once I was let in, the smell of alcohol was nearly overpowering. With as much motivation as a zombie, Peter's dad rejoined his wife on the couch, where they both lifelessly watched the television. Even 8 years later, Nick's death had left a scar on the household. I trudged upstairs and into a dirty, crowded mess of what was once a big living room. The place would have fit right in with an episode of Hoarders. And here's a foreboding detail. Buried under the trash bag of beer cans that was blocking the television, I could see a Nintendo 64 on the floor. As crazy as it sounds, it must have been unused ever since that day, as Nick's GoldenEye copy was still plugged into it. The place reeked of despair. I desperately wanted to leave. But if Peter wanted to talk, if he had answers, then I had to meet with him. He was in his room, also a disaster area. Empty energy drinks lined the floor. I could see that he had grown an unruly beard before he turned around in his computer chair, after exiting some MMORPG I was unfamiliar with. I greeted him as kindly as possible. I could see a sadness in his sunken eyes. But what he was really hiding was his anger. When he spoke to me, it was in what I can only describe as restrained barks. He must have had nothing but hatred for me, which I didn't blame him for. That he was struggling for control. Suddenly, he started laying everything out there, getting it off his chest at long last. His parents had been sending him to a therapist for 8 years since that day, and he said that while she helped, he was making slow progress. He hated the witch inside, because she didn't believe him when he shared his account of the events. He then told me that he had just started going to a psychiatrist, and hoped that he would believe him. Understanding his anger and now feeling nothing but pity, I talked with him calmly and reasonably. He eventually did relax after getting out all of the contempt he had for me. He took a big breath, and his whole body shuddered, as if in anticipation for the forthcoming grand revelation. That was just what I got. As much as it hurt, the truth. At last. And that dreaded vindication I had mentioned at the start of our story. I never returned to his house that day to retrieve the box, assuming the police would take it, but I watched as Peter reached deep under his bed, the space looking like an unnavigatable garbage dump, and pulled out that black box that I'd seen in my dreams many times. He took off the rotted, moist cover, a smell of mold exploding from inside. But it was what he took out of the box that made me truly sick to my stomach. It was the missing hit sensor box. Only the frontal plastic shell had been completely wrapped and scarred by extreme heat. It had partially melted over the black circle in the middle, and the leather straps were charred. Holding back vomit, Peter almost gleefully flipped the device over, as if it damaged his mind. I was supposed to like what he was showing me. The metal back had mostly survived intact, but there was a large dent in the middle where it had made contact with the battery. The hinge, however, no longer locked in place, and the back plate swung open freely to reveal the interior of the shell. There was no sign of the battery itself. Its compartment was solid black, and there seemed to be dried remnants of battery acid. I could only surmise that the battery had exploded in its entirety. However much energy it had inside must have been incredibly lethal.
Justin!
Peter suddenly shouted at me, snapping me out of my dazed, sickly stupor. He then proceeded to call me an idiot repeatedly for not reading the instructions. I whimpered in reply, telling him I didn't see any. In one broad stroke, Peter tore out the styrofoam, which I noticed had already been broken into several pieces. Under what remained of the fractured white block was a thin yellow pamphlet. The guns were printed in black and white on the cover. Now both terrifying and racking me with guilt, he began to shove the moldy instruction booklet into my face, thrusting it until it was a few inches in front of my face each time he turned a page as he yelled at me to read it. Although I was shaking, I tried my best to do so. Most of it was in Arabic, but there were little warning boxes labeled with an exclamation point and a triangle that were in multiple languages, including French, Spanish, and English. Every page had an image of proper use, the boys from the front cover demonstrating various ways of hitting one another with the lasers, or simply how to attach the equipment. Other than a few instances of the radioactive trefoil symbol, the warning seemed innocuous at first. Don't aim at the eyes. Take a break from playing sometimes. Don't use it in the rain, etc. I told Peter I didn't understand what went wrong. I knew enough by this point that he had figured out what killed Nick, and that he had hidden his brother's vest in the box. I told him I was so very sorry, but again I didn't understand. Before he showed me the last page, Peter said he kept the burnt, twisted vest so he could figure out what happened on his own. Maybe he thought the police wouldn't be able to get it. I can't hope to know. Calmer now. He turned the last page and handed me the book. My stomach churned again. The warning was simple, and like the rest of the product, poorly translated. Danger. Critical hit zone. These words were under a diagram of the black hit circle, where an arrow pointed to that small center light. And there was a descriptive image of one of the boys shooting the other, a demonic smile and a look of victory on his face, as he so happily sent the other boy from the box cover into oblivion. The other boy, who was screaming out in raw pain and terror as the vest exploded, and his body turned to fine particles of ash. But Peter wasn't done. He had one last thing to show me. As he reached for the top of the bookcase in his room, I noticed the faint scratch marks on the metal backing of the destroyed hitbox. It looked like someone had taken a screwdriver to it in order to violently scrape something off. Peter showed me a small corked plastic vial that he had taken off his shelf. Inside was a solid black gathering of what appeared to be soot. He gave me a sickening smile and told me, "It's been such a long time since you've seen Nick, hasn't it? Say hi to Nick." I felt myself heave and hit the floor, but nothing came up. My mind scrambled, trying to accept what I had just seen and was told. To imagine the fear, the pain as my friend burnt up into ash so small that it blew away in the light wind. Killed by his own brother. Eagle-Eye Peter, who had scored a critical. Before I turned and ran out of the house, Peter, holding what was left of his twin brother, had some advice. "I'd see a therapist, Justin. It will help." There. I got it all down. Happy, Dr. Strauss? Whether or not anybody reads this, I don't care anymore. Maybe, in time, recording what happened really will help me. I don't know. What I do know is that for an entire day I carried around what I assume was some sick, perverted Eastern European toy maker's idea of a fun game for kids. A walking time bomb waiting for a bullseye hit. How all of its previous owners managed to miss? I have no idea.
If you decide to hunt down another set for some sick dark fantasy, and you're stupid enough to buy it after reading this journal that some idiot stole and posted online,
try not to play with anyone whose shot is worth a damn. There was no telling what was real or what was made up on Creepy Toys forums. I think that when I first read this post, I dismissed it as another made-up story. But I did kind of like the Cold War industrial atomic toy aspect of it. It turns out that it had a final reply that I never saw, made just hours before the forum was shut down permanently. I don't think many, if any, members saw this post before the site was no more. Here it is below.
Hello, I am posting from Poland. I have a good grasp of English. The box you describe sounds much like one I saw in a neighbor's attic. He was a collector of strange things. His box was in a very good condition, with the year of 1986. It still had the original instructions, and I too have seen this image of the boy shooting the other, blowing him up. What a terrifying child toy. It's impossible to say who made it, as there is no company name on the box. So it would also be very difficult to find how many were made. The language on the box and most of the instructions is certainly Belarusian. I wish I could tell you more about the product, but sadly, even as a collector, his box is missing the actual weapons and vests. How strange that a full set would make it all the way to a thrift store in America. I hope therapy gets you through this time in your life. Take care.
Hey guys, it's Wolf. I just wanted to say thank you again for listening to my stories. This is a new thing for me, so again, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to really listen to the stories and give me your feedback. I'm looking forward to doing this more often, again, every Monday and Friday, and if you guys have any ideas of what I should be reading or if I should be editing any differently, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. So if you guys have any feedback for me, that'd be perfect, just because I want to continue to develop this channel and have a lot of fun with it. So yeah, if you guys have anything for me, leave them in the comments below, and hopefully I see you guys in the next one. Thank you again.